Tar Baby, Cassette 3.
The maiden aunts, huddled in the corners of the room, were smiling in their sleep. Jadine flared her nostrils in an effort not to yawn. Another cup of coffee, another glass of port, nothing could bring her alive to the memories of an old man. I ought to be saying something, she thought. I ought to be asking questions and making comments instead of smiling and nodding like a puppet. Hoping there was a residue of interest in her eyes, she held her chin toward him and continued to smile, but only a little, in case what he was remembering was poignant, but not happy. Long ago, she had given up trying to be deft or profound or anything in the company of people she was not interested in, who didn't thrill her. Gazing at the stem of crystal, she knew that whatever he was saying, her response was going to miss the point entirely. Her mind was in automatic park. She played with the little bit of port, gently swirling it around the well of her glass. Sunday, he was saying, with the bellful voice of ownership like In the Land or The Whole of London or To Paris. He had a smile like Sunday. His Sunday. She wondered what Sunday was to this tall, thin man with eyes like the gloaming. Light, warmth, a drawing room full of flowers. He was pouring himself a fifth glass of wine, too morose, too preoccupied with Sundays to think of offering her more. The peaches and walnuts were quiet in their silver bowls. She took a cigarette from a crystal cigarette holder. Next to it lay a round matchbox, patterned like an Indian carpet. Inside were tiny white matchsticks, with speckled gold heads that exploded with a hiss when struck. 3 months, no, 2, and the quiet to which the house succumbed at night still disturbed her. Sunset, 3 minutes of Titian blue, and deep night. And with it, a solid earth-bound silence. No crickets, no frogs, no mosquitoes up here. Only the sounds heard or imagined that humans made. The hiss of a gold-headed match, the short cascade of wine into a goblet, the faint, very faint click and clatter of the kitchen being tidied, and now a scream, so loud and full of terror it woke the maiden aunts from their sleep in the corners of the room. And when they saw those blue, if it's a boy, blue eyes gone white with fear, they fled, pulling their maiden hair behind them. She stood in the doorway screaming, first at Valerian, and then at Jadine, who rushed to her side. What? What is it? But she would not stop. She just balled her beautiful hands into fists and pummeled her own temples, screaming louder. Valerian stared through port-softened eyes at his wife as though he, not she, were in pain. What is it, Margaret? Jadine put her arm around her shoulders. Sidney and Andine both burst through the other door. What's the matter? I don't know. She heard herself. I don't know. Hold her hands or she will. What is it? What happened? Then Andine, fed up, shouted, Speak, woman! And Margaret sank to her knees, gasping for the breath with which to whisper the words, In my closet, in my closet. Her what? Her closet, something in her closet. What's in your closet? Black, she whispered, her eyes tight shut. Nadine dropped to her knees and leaned close to Margaret's face. You mean it's dark in your closet? Margaret shook her head and put the back of her fist in her mouth. Then Valerian spoke for the first time since she had come screaming into the room. Margaret, this is not the Met. It's a simple house on a simple island. Michael's not even here yet, but she was screaming again. And Jadine had to shout, Tell me, tell me. In my things, said Margaret, in all my things. What's she saying? Go look in her closet. Take the gun, Sidney. Andine was the ranking officer, barking instructions. Right, he answered, and ran back through the door to the kitchen. And be careful, Andine shouted after him. Hadn't I better call the harbor, Valerian? Asked Jadine. Don't leave me, shrieked Margaret. All right, Nadine, give her some of that wine. Maybe she's had enough of that. No, she drank hardly anything. I heard her slam up the stairs in the middle of my dinner, said Andine. Between then and now, she could have killed a quart. Andine spoke without moving her lips, hoping it was enough to keep Valerian from hearing. "He's in my things, Jade." Margaret was crying softly. Okay. You have to believe me." "I don't smell anything on her breath. Maybe she just flipped." Andine was mumbling again. "Can't you get her to a chair?" asked Valerian. He hated seeing her bent over like that on the floor. "Come on, honey. Let's sit here," said Jadine. "What are you doing?" Margaret was screaming again and trying to stand. "Why are you acting like that? He's there. I saw him. Valerian, please, somebody better. Go call the harbor." "Let's wait for Sydney before we call the police," said Andine. "She's drunk," said Valerian with the wisdom of the drunk, "and nobody's paid her any attention for a whole hour." "Why don't you believe me?" She looked around at them all. They looked back at her, each thinking why, indeed, he didn't. And then they heard the footsteps of Sydney, plus one. Into the light of the 64-bulb chandelier came Sydney, pointing a .32 caliber pistol at the shoulder blades of a black man with dreadlock hair. "It's him!" Margaret screamed. "Have mercy," said Andine. "You can call the harbor now, Mr. Street," said Sydney. "I'll do it," said Andine. Jadine said nothing. She didn't dare. Valerian's mouth was open, and he closed it before saying in a voice made stentorian by port, "Good evening, sir. Would you care for a drink?" The black man looked at Valerian, and it seemed to Jadine that there was a lot of space around his eyes. Chapter 4. Bees have no sting on Ile des Chevaliers, nor honey. They are fat and lazy, curious about nothing, especially at noon. At noon, parrots sleep, and diamondbacks work down the trees toward the cooler undergrowth. At noon, the water in the mouths of orchids left there by the breakfast rain is warm. Children stick their fingers in them and scream as though scalded. People in town go inside because the sky weighs too much at noon. They wait for hot food with lots of pepper, so the day will feel cooler by comparison. They drink sweet drinks and swallow bitter coffee to distract their insides from the heat and weight of the sky. But the eaves of the house on Ile des Chevaliers were deep, the curtains light and light-filtering, so the sky did not require the occupants to distract themselves. They were free to concentrate on whichever of their personal problems they wished. The wrapped and shelved ones, the ones they always meant to take down and open one day, or the ones they caressed every hour. Just as on beaches, in summer homes, and watering places, tourists the world over lay under the breeze behind their anti-sunglasses, wondering and mulling. So mulled the occupants of l'Arbre de la Croix that noon, the day after a man with living hair stayed for dinner. Outwardly, everything looked the same. Only the emperor butterflies appeared excited about something. Such vigorous flapping and blazing heat was uncommon for them. They hovered near the bedroom windows, but the shutters had remained closed all morning, and none of them could see a thing. They knew, however, that the woman was in there. Her blue blue eyes red-rimmed with longing for a trailer, softened by columbine, and for her ma, Leonora, the daily communicant. Leonora, whose head was covered at Mass with lace older than Maine itself, who at 60 folded away her stockings, and from then on wore white socks with her black Cuban-heeled Oxfords. Sweet, darling socks, out of which grew strong, wide legs that had never been crossed at the knees. "I have come full circle, Ma," thought Margaret. Now that the breakfast rain was over, and clean light filtered through the shutters, she was amazed to discover how much like the trailer it was. Full circle, she thought. I have come full circle. The trailer had been like this room. All economy and parallel lines, all secret storage and uncluttered surfaces. South Suzanne's idea of luxury back then had been the antique stuffed houses of old Bangor families, blue bottles and white moldings, soft yellow wallpaper, and recovered federal chairs. But Margaret loved the trailer best. And when she married a non-Catholic over the objections of her parents and moved to Philadelphia, it took years to get rid of the afterboom. And now that she had, he'd left it and put her in this room that was sculpted, he said, not decorated. That for all its Mies van der Rohe and Max whatever, reminded her of the trailer in South Suzanne, where she had been the envy of her girlfriends for the first dozen years of her life, and was 14 before she discovered that everybody in South Suzanne had not shared that envy, did not think the little toilet was cute, or the way the tables folded down and beds became sofas was really neat, like having your own dollhouse to live in. And when she did discover that most people thought living in a trailer was tacky, it might have crushed the life out of her, except that she discovered at the same time that all of South Suzanne was overwhelmed by her astonishing good looks. She agreed finally with their evaluation, but it didn't help much because it meant she had to be extra nice to other girls to keep them from getting mad at her. It meant having teachers go fuzzy in her presence, the men with glee, the women with distrust, fighting off cousins in cars, dentists in chairs, and feeling apologetic to every woman over 30. Privately, she neither valued it nor enjoyed it. And before she could learn to use it properly, she met an older man who was never fuzzy in her presence. She knew that because almost the first thing he said to her was, "You really are beautiful," as if it could have been fake like the float but wasn't. And she smiled because he seemed surprised. "Is that enough?" she asked. And it was the first honest response she had ever made to a male compliment. "Beauty is never enough," he said, "but you are." The safety she heard in his voice was in his nice square fingernails, too. And it was that, not his money, that comforted her and made her feel of consequence under the beauty, back down beneath it, where her Margarethood lay in the same cup it had always lain in, faceless, silent, and trying like hell to please. And now she longed for her mother's trailer so far from Philadelphia and L'Arbre de la Croix, but maybe not so far after all, since the bedroom she had locked herself into was a high-class duplication, minus the coziness of the first. Margaret Lenore stared into the spaces and thought desperately of coffee, but she didn't want to ring up Sydney or Andine, for that would begin the day she was not sure she wanted to participate in. She had had no sleep to speak of, and now, drained of panic, wavering between anger and sorrow, she lay in bed. Things were not getting better. She was not getting better. She could feel it, and right smack in the middle of it, with Michael on his way, this had to happen. Literally a nigger in the woodpile. And, of course, Valerian had to think up something to shock everybody and actually ask him to dinner. A stranger who was found hiding in his own wife's closet, a bum that even Sydney wanted to shoot, he invited to dinner, while she was shaking like a leaf on the floor. In her closet. The end, the living end. But as disgusting as that was, it wasn't as bad as Valerian's insult, that it was okay for him to be there. And if it wasn't for the fact that Michael was coming, she would pack up that very day and really leave him this time. Valerian knew it, too, knew he could get away with it, because Michael's Christmas visit was so important to her and would keep her from leaving. Now he was playing that boring music in the greenhouse, as though nothing had happened. She was so hungry and coffee-starved, but she couldn't start things off just yet. And Jade hadn't knocked at all. Usually, when Margaret overslept, Jade woke her with a smile, some funny piece of mail, or an exciting advertisement. She would sink her cup of chocolate into Margaret's carpet. There were no end tables in the chic, sparse sculpture, and they would begin the day with some high-spirited, girlish nonsense. "Look, Chloe has 4 new perfumes. 4! I think Mr. Broughton's lover has gone. You've been invited to dinner. You'd better go, 'cause I think her mistress is due to visit them soon. Have you seen the 3 of them eating together? Andine says the cook over there said it makes her sick." Long ago, when Jade used to come for holiday visits, Margaret found her awkward and pouty, but now that she was grown up, she was pretty and a lot of fun. All those colleges hadn't made her uppity, and she was not at all the Mother Superior Andine had become. She didn't know how the dinner went. Did Jade stay? When did the man leave? She lifted her hand to press a button, then changed her mind. Maybe the man killed everybody, and she alone escaped because she had run up to her room and locked herself in. No, if he had, the boring music would not be going. God! Maybe he will come back and do it later. And what could they do to stop him? All the neighbors would have to be told that a black man had been roaming around, and it could happen again. They would have to share security and keep in touch with each other. Each house could post one of the help, so that around the clock someone was on guard. She wouldn't mention Valerian's feeding him dinner first, and trying to make her stay there and watch him eat. The neighbors would think he was crazy and blame him for whatever the burglar did. Maybe he was already in jail. He couldn't have gotten off the island last night, but early in the morning, she'd heard the jeep take off and return. Sydney probably drove him to the launch, where harbor police shackled him. In any case, she wasn't going to pretend what Valerian did was okay by her. He hadn't even bothered to come in and explain, let alone apologize to her. Just as he never bothered to explain why he wouldn't go back to the States. He really expected her to steam in that jungle, knowing as he did what heat and sun and wind did to her skin. Knowing that after Maine, Philadelphia was a torrid zone for her. That her arms went pimento with even a little sun, and her back burst into pebbles. Still, he stayed in this place she had never enjoyed, except when Michael was younger and they all vacationed there. No, it was a boiling graveyard made bearable, just bearable, by Jade's company, shopping in Queen of France, and lunches with the neighbors. She would never get through Christmas here without Michael. Never. Already the confusion was coming back. The salad things last night, for instance, and earlier at breakfast. But with Michael around, she never forgot the names and uses of things. Margaret Street closed her eyes and turned over on her stomach, although she knew she would not sleep again. All night she'd been conscious of the closet door, where she had gone to find the poem just to make sure Valerian was making fun of her, and that there really was the line, and he glittered when he walked, in the poem Bridges had dedicated to Michael. It was a walk-in closet, with dressing room separate from the wardrobe, and a tiny storage niche at the very back where she kept things. And in there, right among all her most private stuff, she saw him sitting on the floor, as calm as you please, and as filthy as could be. He looked at her, but never moved, and it seemed like hours before she could back out, and hours more before she could make sound come from her open mouth, and how she got down the stairs she would never in this world know. But when she did, it was like a dream, with them looking at her, but not looking as though they believed her, and Valerian was worst of all, sitting there, like some lord or priest who doubted her confession, the completeness of it, and let her know with his eyes that she'd left something important out, like the salad things. She had lain there all night, with the lights on, thinking of her closet as a toilet now, where something rotten had been, and still was. Only at dawn did she slip into a light and unrefreshing sleep, not dreaming something she was supposed to be dreaming. She was exhausted when she woke, but as night disappeared, so did her fear. Among the many things she felt, anger was the most consistent, but even that kept sliding away, as her thoughts, unharnessed, turned sorrowful and galloped back to Leonora, and a trailer sunk in Columbine. It was getting unbearably hot, but she wouldn't toss aside the sheet. Her door was locked. Jade would come soon to see about her. Valerian could do what he wished. She herself would not budge. In her things, actually in her things, probably jerking off. Black sperm was sticking in clots to her French jeans, or down in the toe of her Anne Klein shoes. Didn't men sometimes jerk off in women's shoes? She'd have the whole closet full cleaned, or, better still, she'd throw them all out, and buy everything new, from scratch. What a louse Valerian was. What a first-class louse. Wait till Michael hears about it. Just wait. And then she was crying about the night she won the beauty contest in a strapless gown that her mother had to borrow money from Uncle Adolph for, and a gold cross that she'd always wore until her sister-in-law told her only whores wore crosses. The bitch. She lay there wiping teary cheeks with the top hem of a Vera sheet. There was nothing the cool, sculptured spaces could do to keep her from forgetting the fact that she was almost 50, sitting on a hill in the middle of a jungle, in the middle of the ocean, where the temperature was on broil, and not even a TV with anything on it she could understand, and where her husband was punishing her for forgetting to put the salad things back, and there was no one to talk to except Jade, and where her sex life had become such a wreck it was downright interesting. And if that wasn't enough, now this nigger, he lets in this real, live, dope addict ape just to get back at her, wanting to live near Michael. We'll see about that, she said. Just wait till Michael comes. She whispered, so nobody would hear, and nobody did, not even the emperor butterflies. They were clinging to the windows of another bedroom, trying to see for themselves what the angel trumpets had described to them. The hides of 90 baby seals, stitched together so nicely you couldn't tell what part had sheltered their cute little hearts and which had cushioned their skulls. They had not seen the coat at all, but a few days ago a bunch of them had heard the woman called Jade telling the woman called Margaret all about it. The butterflies didn't believe it and went to see for themselves. Sure enough, there it was, swirling around the naked body of the woman called Jade, who opened the French windows and greeted the emperor butterflies with a smile. But the heavy one, called Andine, said, "Shoo, shoo." "Leave them alone, Nonadine. They don't bother anything. They die and have to be swept up. You should put some clothes on and cover yourself up. I thought you asked me to come up and see your coat, not your privates. This is the best way to feel it. Here, feel." Well, it's nice enough, no question about that. Mr. Street see it yet? No, just you and Margaret. What'd she say? She loved it. Said it was prettier than hers. Does this mean you're going to marry him? Jadine dug her hands deep into the pockets and spun around. Her hair was as black and shiny as the coat. Who knows? He must mean business if he fly that out to you all the way from Paris. And he must expect you back there. Lord knows you don't need a sealskin coat down here. It's just a Christmas present, Nonadine. It's not just anything, honey. I could buy a house with what that cost. No, you couldn't. I'd lock it up somewhere if I were you. I have to find a cool place for it. Maybe Valerian will let me use the air-conditioned part of his greenhouse. You crazy? Don't you dare leave that coat out there. There you go again. Nothing's going to happen, I told you. He'll be out of here by tonight. He better be. I'm not going to spend another night under the same roof with him. Apparently, you've spent several. We all have. Well, I didn't know it. Although why I didn't, I can't figure. Stuff has been missing for weeks. All my chocolate, the Evian. No telling what else. I'm going to take inventory, me and Sidney. What for? What he ate? Just replace. He'll be out of here tomorrow. You said tonight. It's not my house, Nonadine. Valerian invited him to dinner. Crazy. So, it's Valerian who has to tell him to go. Why'd he put him in the guest room, though? Sidney almost had a stroke when Mr. Street told him to take him there. Well, if he didn't have a stroke when he said hi to him, he won't have one at all. He said hi? Sidney didn't tell me about that. Unbelievable. Well, I can't stay up here gawking at a coat. I have to get the breakfast things cleared up. Did you call Solange yet? No, I'll do it now. How did you manage to place orders before I came? It was a mess, believe me. I can't get my tongue right for that language. 3 geese, then, and another quart of raspberries. That should do it. I wish they'd tell me things. How can I cook if I don't know how many's eaten? Andine walked over to Jadine's bed and straightened the sheets. Now, when is he due? Christmas Eve, I think. Just after Michael gets here. You sure? No, but if he's a Christmas present, he'll have to be here by Christmas, won't he? Can't believe that. Giving your son a whole human being for a Christmas present. Michael worships him. Took all his courses at college. Now he'll own him, I suspect. What money can't buy. I got to go. I want to fix a nice lunch for Sidney. He's still shook. Tell him not to worry. I'll try. But you saw him at breakfast. Mean as a tampered rooster. It'll be all right now. I'm telling you. Andine left, holding her hand to her neck, hoping Jadine was right, and that Mr. Street was finished being funny and would get rid of that thieving Negro before it was too late. A crazy white man and a crazy black is a shake too much, she thought. She glanced quickly down the hall to the door of the room where he had been put. It was closed. Still asleep, she guessed. A night prowler. Sleeps all day, prowls all night. Jadine took off the sealskin coat and wiped her damp neck. She thought of another quick shower before she dressed, but decided against it. Hot as it was, the seal feel was too good to let go. She put the coat back on, sat down, and dialed Solange. No response other than a light, free-floating buzz. Everybody on Ile des Chevaliers seemed to live rather well without good telephone service. She and Margaret used it more than all the families combined. Since she had come, shopping had become a major part of Margaret's life, as it had always been her own. She fondled the hides of 90 baby seals and went to the closet thinking she may as well begin wrapping her gifts. There were a dozen shirts for Sidney, who loved fine cloth, and a stunning black chiffon dress for Andine. A little overdone, but Andine liked that. Zircons on the bodice and the waist, swirls of chiffon skirting. And the best thing, black suede shoes with zircons studding the heels. Hooker shoes. Andine wouldn't be able to walk long in them, but how she would reign from a sitting position. She had wanted to get her a tiara, too, but maybe that was pushing it. The dress she packed neatly in a box among layers of tissue paper. The zircon-studded shoes went into a red satin shoe bag. Perspiration was forming on her forehead as she'd finished, and she blotted it away without ever taking off the coat. Both Sidney's and Andine's presents were too large for the wrapping paper she had, so she put them aside and wrapped Valerian's record album. Finally, she had to admit she was stifling and took the coat off. Naked, she walked to the window. The emperor butterflies were gone now. Not one had fallen dead on the Karistan. Only the bougainvillea saw her standing in the window, her head thrown back to catch all the breeze she could in the soft place under her chin. I'm all done, she thought, except for a half hour or so of finishing Margaret's chain of gold coins. Unless, of course, she was expected to buy something for Michael. Should she? Should the, social secretary buy a present for the son of her employer, patron? She could exchange gifts with the Streets because she had known them so long, and they were like family, almost, and had given her so much. But she wasn't sure if giving a gift to their son was not a presumption. If she were married to Rick, coat and all, it would be all right. Her status would be unquestioned. But like this, she had seen him only twice. He was always at prep school or camp or some spa when she visited before. A gift would embarrass him, probably, because he wouldn't have gotten one for her. Or would he? What had Margaret told him about the household? Even so, would he be offended by a gift from her, however modest? No, of course not. He was a poet, presumably, and a socialist, so social awkwardness wouldn't trouble him the way it would have his father. But if she did get him one, it would have to be something earthy and non-capitalistic. She smiled. A loaf of bread, maybe. Footsteps on the gravel interrupted her. That must be Yard Man, come to mount the Christmas tree. Jadine stepped away from the window so Yardman couldn't see her nakedness, wondering what he would think of the black man in the guest room. She went to the bed, where the skins of the 90 baby seals sprawled. She lay on top of them and ran her fingertips through the fur. How black, how shiny, smooth. She pressed her thighs deep into its dark luxury. Then she lifted herself up a little and let her nipples brush the black hairs back and forth, back and forth. It had frightened Andine, the coat. She spoke as though the marriage was all right, but Jadine knew Andine would be heartsick. More and more, Sidney and Andine looked to her for solutions to their problems. They had been her parents since she was 12, and now she was required to parent them, guide them, do the small chores that put them in touch with the outside world, soothe them, allay their fears. Like with that wild man sleeping down the hall. She had to calm them and make them understand Valerian's whimsy. Style, all style, that was Valerian. He had once been mugged on a trip to Miami. He stood there, his arms over his head, while the muggers, some black teenagers with rags around their heads, ran their fingers through his pockets. One of them looked at him and must have seen the disdain in Valerian's eyes. He sneered at Valerian and said, "You don't like us, do you?" "Gentlemen," Valerian had replied, "I don't know you." It must have been that same antique grace that made him look at a raggedy black man who had been hiding in his wife's closet, with rape, theft, or murder on his mind, and say, "Good evening," and offer him a drink. Then tell Sidney to prepare another place for our guest. Jade smiled as she pushed her nipples into the baby seal's skin. You had to give it to him. He was marvelous. All while the man ate limp salad, flat souffle, peaches, and coffee, Valerian behaved as though it was the most ordinary of incidents. Margaret never left off shaking, and would not stay at the table in spite of Valerian's insistence that she do so. She locked her bedroom door and, according to Sidney, did not come down for breakfast. Only Valerian was there with his robust morning appetite. Jadine and Valerian held up the conversation, and it was Jadine who cautioned Sidney and Andine with meaningful looks to help them get through the serving with composure. At one point, after the man was seated, and when Sidney held the bowl of salad toward him, the man looked up and said, "Hi." For the first time in his life, Sidney had dropped something. He collected the salad greens and righted the bowl expertly, but his anger and frustration were too strong to hide. He tried his best to be no less dignified than his employer, but he barely made it to civility. Valerian, however, was splendid. As soon as the man sat down, Valerian was sober. Jadine thought she may have imagined it, but she believed Valerian was comforted, made more secure by her presence at the table, that she exercised some restraint on the man, that Valerian believed that in her presence the man might be kept manageable. At any rate, he sipped his brandy as though the man's odor wasn't there. He didn't even blink when the man poured his demitasse into the saucer and blew on it gently before sipping it through a lump of sugar. More than grace, she thought. Valerian had courage. He could not have known, could not know even now, what the nigger was up to. He didn't even know his real name. "How long have you been with us, mister? I'm sorry, I don't know your name." The man looked up from his plate. His mouth was full, and he chewed silently and swallowed before he answered. 5 days. A week, maybe. "And before that?" asked Valerian. The man removed the pit of a black olive from his mouth. "Swamp." "Oh, yes. Saint-Divier." "It couldn't have been very comfortable for you there. The local people avoid it entirely. Spirits live there, I'm told." The man didn't answer. "Did you see any ghosts while you were there?" Jadine asked him. He shook his head, but didn't look at her. "No, but I guess they saw me." Valerian laughed heartily. "Are you a believer, then?" "Sometimes," said the man. "Sometimes? You pick and choose when to believe and when not?" "In a swamp, I believe," said the man. An excellent solution. Excellent. Valerian chuckled. He seemed to be enjoying himself thoroughly. You're not local, are you? Your accent is American, am I correct? Yeah. Have you just left there? No. The man sopped the salad dressing on his plate with a round of French bread and gulped it down. Then he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Jumped ship, tried to swim ashore, couldn't make it, so I climbed aboard this boat I thought was going to dock there, but it brought me here. I waited a few days for a way to get back, nothing. So I came to the first house I saw. He glanced at Jadine, good and hungry by then. He was exhausted, it seemed, having said so much. Reasonable, said Valerian, but I'm confused. Is there a pantry in my wife's bedroom? He glanced at the man's profile. Huh? Valerian smiled, but did not repeat the question. He wants to know why you were in the bedroom, said Jadine. If you were just feeding yourself, that is. Oh, I got tired of sitting in one spot all day. I was just looking around. I heard footsteps and I hid. He looked around at them as though his reply had finally solved everything, and he could now be sociable. Nice pad you got here, he said, smiling. And that's when Jadine felt the first bolt of fear. As long as he was burrowing in his plate like an animal, grunting in monosyllables, but not daring to look up, she was without fear. But when he smiled, she saw small dark dogs galloping on silver feet. More to regain her confidence than to get information, she asked him, Why didn't you take the boat? What? He looked at her quickly and just as quickly looked away. You said you were waiting to get to Dominique. The Seabird is docked. If you've been to sea, you could have managed the boat. He stared at his plate and said nothing. Boats are highly visible, dear, Valerian said to Jadine, and call a great deal of attention to themselves. He smiled at the man and went on. I'm sorry, but I don't know your name. That makes us even, said the man with a wide smile. I don't know yours either. And they still didn't. But Valerian instructed him to be put up in the guest room anyway. And Sidney's jawbones were still working back and forth the next morning as he told his wife and niece about putting silk pajamas out for him. Jadine laughed and said he would slide out of the bed in them, but Sidney couldn't see any humor in it. And Andine was too concerned about her husband to join the pretty, careless girl in laughter. Andine picked up an onion and pressed it for soft spots. Things went back to their natural state so quickly in that place. A layer of slippery skin gave way beneath her thumb, but the onion was firm underneath. At that moment, Yardman scratched the screen door, and when Andine turned to look, she saw his bloodied shirt first, and then his foolish smile. Leave it. She turned back to her table and tossed the words over her shoulder. Put some newspapers down out there. He broadened his smile and nodded vigorously, but Andine didn't see that. She assumed it, and, as an afterthought, lest he think she had no manners at all, she said, Thanks. She put down the onion and turned one eye of the gas range up high. In fact, the thanks was sincere, for she felt guilty about letting him do what was once a marked skill of her own. Can't do it any more, she thought. Have to chase around too much. She didn't like asking Yardman to do it for her, but her feet were too tender and her ankles too swollen to manage, so when he brought 4 or 5 young hens tied in a crate, she told him she needed only one at a time. Let the others pick around behind the wash house, and then ring one of them for me while you're at it. Yes, madam, he said as he always said. Are they young, tender? She had asked him. Yes, madam. Don't look it. Look like brooders. No, madam. Pull it, every one. We'll see, she answered him. Mind how you go. I don't want to be scrubbing up blood all afternoon. But he was bloody anyway, so she said, Leave it, to let him know that he had killed it wrong, and also to remind him that she did not want him in her kitchen. And there it was on the newspaper, and wouldn't you know, He had not plucked one single feather. Heavenly Father, that'll take me forever. She lifted her head to call him back. Come right back here, she was going to say, but suddenly she was too tired. Too tired to fuss, too tired to even have to confront him with his sloppiness. She sighed, picked up the chicken, and brought it into the kitchen. She hoisted a large pot of water onto the burning eye and wondered what he did with the head and feet. When the water was hot enough, she dropped the chicken in and held it down with a wooden ladle long enough to loosen the pins. Then she removed it from the hot water and with newspaper spread out started to pluck. She was still nimble at it, but slower than she would have been if she wasn't being careful about where the feathers went. A big nuisance to have to do it herself. It was going to make Sidney's lunch late, but she didn't feel up to seeing Yardman again or giving him an order angrily, firmly, or even sweetly. Yesterday, everything was all right. The best it could be, and exactly the way she had hoped it would be. A good man whom she trusted, a good and permanent job doing what she was good at for a boss who appreciated it, beautiful surroundings, which included her own territory, where she alone governed, and now with Jadine back, a child, whom she could enjoy, indulge, protect, and since this child was a niece, it was without the stress of a mother-daughter relationship. She was uneasy about the temporary nature of their stay on the island, and Margaret's visits always annoyed her, but it was being there that made Jade want to stay with them for a longish spell. Otherwise, their niece would light anywhere except back in Philadelphia. She hoped Mr. Street would stay on in spite of his addled wife. Now, here come this man upstairs in the guest room. Maybe Jadine was right, she thought. He would be gone today or certainly the next, and they were making too much of it. Andine stopped plucking and lifted her eyes slowly to the place where the window shutters did not quite close. A bit of the sky was unhidden by foliage. She thought she heard a small, smooth sound, like a well-oiled gear shifting. Not a sound, really, more of an imagined impression, as though she were a dust mote watching an eye blink. There would be the hurricane wind of the eyelashes falling through the air and the weighty crash of lid on lid.
This ends side 1 of cassette 3. Please turn the cassette over and start side 2 at the same point.